Thanks for joining us. You are here for the webinar, Get Out the Vote Nonprofit Edition. I'm Lauren Kay. I'm the Director of Communications and Marketing here at CalNonprofits. I'm just going to take a moment to say a word about CalNonprofits. We're a policy alliance. We're 10,000 members strong. We're a vital voice for our state's nonprofit sector. We work in Sacramento to make sure nonprofits have a say in the decisions that are made about us in the communities we serve. And together, we're involved in supporting and helping develop laws and policies that are empowering and supportive of the work of nonprofits throughout the state. We have a lot of opportunities for learning like this webinar, and we also hold town halls with lawmakers. We collaborate on an ongoing series of policy forums, and we hold an annual policy convention. That's in the fall. In about a week, we're going to be gathering in Sacramento in person for a lunch we sponsor as part of California Nonprofits Day and the annual Nonprofit of the Year honors. We've got a lot of other programs and projects like our student debt project, Vote with Our Mission campaign, Vote with Your Mission campaign, which is very relevant to today's webinar. And we invite you to learn more and, of course, to join us. Our moderator today for the webinar is my colleague, Lucy Saucedo-Carter. She's the Public Policy Director for CalNonprofits. And Lucy, you can take it from here.
Okay, hi everyone, and thank you, Lauren. So, you are here for Get Out the Vote Nonprofit Edition, so welcome to everybody. We are recording the event, so you will be able to access a link to the recording later. I wanted to say just a couple more things about CalNonprofits. Thank you, Lauren, for doing that introduction. She mentioned that we are a policy alliance. We protect and enhance the ability of nonprofits to serve our communities, and we do that through our advocacy, mostly at the state level, but also at the federal level with national partners, and we also support local advocacy. So we don't do it directly ourselves, but we definitely support you and other nonprofits doing it. So, and we are essentially what we think of as being like a chamber of commerce for nonprofits. Lauren mentioned the Vote with Your Mission campaign that we have done over the years. It's got some great tips in it that are very relevant to the webinar today. So please check that out. I know our awesome tech team will be putting that information in the chat for you. So please take a look at that. It's got practical information for you. And we've got a lot of great practical information for you today. So in fact, I'm going to start with covering some legal do's and don'ts related to elections. I think it's good to know what our parameters are as we do this work. So, and before I do that, I wanted to just say a bit about why it makes sense for nonprofits to do voter engagement work. And we'll hear from our panelists a bit more about why they do this work. But we get to take a stand as nonprofits when we help people vote. We get to stand up, and I'll talk a little bit more about the parameters around that, but we get to stand up as nonprofits. And we are trusted conveyors of information. Our communities trust us. So when we provide nonpartisan information about elections to our communities, they pay attention and they trust the information that we provide. And we can do voter engagement as part of the other work we do. So, I don't want people to think that you have to be a civic engagement organization or an advocacy organization to do this work. Direct service providers can do this work as well. So I want to really encourage you to keep that in mind. And I also wanted to remind you that you can include people who aren't able to vote in your voter engagement work. They can be helping to register voters and do other voter engagement work. So just wanted to make those points, and then we'll hear a lot more from our panelists. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so I'm going to talk now about some legal do's and don'ts for 501c3s in particular. So I want to be sure there are different rules for C4s, but I'm going to go over the rules for C3s. Next slide. Okay, here is the most important thing that you need to remember about the legal do's and don'ts. It's really the big takeaway that I would like for you to have. We cannot intervene as 501c3s in or influence a candidate election, including through campaign efforts. So this is the actual rule, the language that you see in front of you, but I want you to remember we cannot intervene or influence a candidate election. Let's go to the next slide. So who's a candidate? A candidate is an individual who is running for an elected local, state, or federal office. Appointees are not considered candidates. So when the governor appoints somebody to a task force or to a position, that doesn't count as a candidacy election. So it has to be local, state, or federal elected, an individual running for an elected position in those places. Next slide. You cannot endorse a specific candidate or contribute to their campaign. Next slide. And there are some pretty hefty consequences, so I want you to keep those in mind. If you are caught crossing that line, you may first get an IRS warning or be subject to an IRS audit, and ultimately you can have your tax exempt status taken away. So good to know what the consequences are. So let's go to the next slide. We can take positions on policy issues. So, we can do all kinds of advocacy, and I'm not going to get into that in this presentation because the focus is on elections specifically. But we can take a position on policy issues, including issues where candidates may not agree. Candidates for an elected position may not agree. What we can't do is make an issue statement that shows any kind of partisan position with regard to a candidate. So that shows that we as an organization favor or disfavor a particular candidate. So there's a range of factors that the IRS will consider in looking at that, in looking at whether you've crossed that line. And one of the key ones is whether you mention the election and whether it's close to the time of the election. When you talk about this issue, I mean, to be really safe, you can talk about the issue, but you want to be careful not to point out particular candidates and their positions on it, or talk about a specific election that's coming up. So be careful along those lines. Next slide. You can communicate with individual candidates about the policy issues that you care about. And so, but you want to be sure to reach out to all candidates when you do that. Again, one of the key words here is to be nonpartisan in your activities. So you don't want to ever ask a candidate to take you don't want to ask them publicly to pledge support for an issue if they are elected. That's actually crossing over the line. Next slide. There's lots of things that nonprofits can do. You can do voter guides. They have to be nonpartisan. You want to try to include every candidate in that voter guide. One way to ensure that you're including objective information in the voter guide is to do something like a questionnaire where you provide some nonpartisan questions to all of the candidates, and then when you create your voter guide, quoting their answers as verbatim as you can be, really make sure that you're staying nonpartisan in the information that you include in your voter guides. But again, because you are a trusted conveyor of information, this is a great way for you to share information with your community in a nonpartisan way, and they trust the information that you're going to share. Next slide. You can also do candidate forums. Again, you want to invite all of the candidates, and you want to be sure that the questioners, the people who are asking the candidates the questions, are nonpartisan and are presenting their questions in a nonpartisan way, and that the questions themselves are nonpartisan. And also, make sure that you include a broad range of issues. So you don't want to just zero in on a really partisan issue that that doesn't convey that you are including information from all of the candidates in a nonpartisan way. Next slide. Okay, voter registration is a great thing for nonprofits to take on. Again, it has to be nonpartisan, so you don't want to be just registering a particular party, voters in a particular party. You want your messages also about registering to vote and about voting to be nonpartisan. In your messages, you don't want to make a partisan statement or take a partisan stance when you are encouraging people to vote. So there's some examples here about what's neutral and what wouldn't be safe. You can see that that one that isn't safe refers to a policy issue that definitely divides people along partisan lines. Next slide. Employees and board members cannot take stances on candidates in their role, in their organizational role. So they can't say, I am so-and-so and I represent this organization and I believe this candidate is the best. They can take those stances as themselves, as individuals. They can take personal stances, but they cannot mention the organization and any affiliation with the organization in that context. And they also cannot use organization resources. So want to be really careful that, that you don't do that. Next slide. So far we've been talking about candidate elections and what 501c3s can and can't do, but I did want to mention something that's really important for us as nonprofits, as advocates. We can take a position on ballot measures. It is considered lobbying, and there are limits on how much lobbying we can do, and I could go into more detail on that. I'm not going to in this webinar. That's another topic, and I'll point you to some resources that you can access to learn more about that. Really encourage you to think about yourselves as advocates and to remember that nonprofits can lobby. And so part of the lobbying that we can do is to take public and official positions on ballot measures. Next slide. So here are some resources that you all can access. Boulder Advocacy has great information about election-specific legal do's and don'ts, but also about rules that we have to follow when doing advocacy and lobbying. So really encourage you to take a look at Boulder Advocacy. And the other one is the official information from the IRS. Great, let's go to the next slide. And by the way, I just wanted to let all the participants know there will be time for Q&A at the end of the webinar, but I want to make sure that we get to all the things that nonprofits can do. So we're going to move on to the panel now. And I want to introduce our panelists. So we have Cordelia Istel from Arts for LA. And we have Kristen Nimmers, who is the Policy and Campaign Manager for the California Black Power Network. And we have Michelle Cusano, who is the Executive Director of the Richmond Neighborhood Center in San Francisco. So welcome, panelists. Really great to hear from you, to hear what you all are doing and hope to do in this work. So if we could just start with hearing from each of you about, first of all, the organization that you represent and the work that your organization is doing, or the work of your network has done to engage and educate voters regarding elections. And we'll get to some of the other issues. If you could take, 3 to 5 minutes or something like that to get us started, and then we'll ask some other questions. So let's start with you, Kristen, if you don't mind.
Yes, thank you. Thank you all for having me. Again, Kristen, Policy and Campaign Manager with the Black Power Network. We are a grassroots coalition of Black-led and Black-serving organizations throughout the state. We grew from the work of the California Black Census and Redistricting Hub, where we were focused on expanding voter access and ensuring underrepresented communities were involved in the redistricting process. And through those projects, we also did direct voter engagement, where we reached out to over 1 million residents in the census and 2020 election. But we've also worked to build capacity of our coalition members. So we're also working to build the voter engagement capacity of Black-led and Black-serving nonprofits throughout the state. And then as the Black Power Network, which we've transitioned to from the redistricting hub, we're working as a coalition to address discrimination, systemic racism, and anti-Black racism, which really includes expanding accessibility and participation in our election processes. And I guess I'll pass to the other panelists.
Great, thanks, Kristen. Michelle, do you want to go next? I think, because you're a direct service provider, I think it's really interesting to hear too from you how you approach this work.
Great, great. Yeah, thank you so much for having me here. I'm the executive director of the Richmond Neighborhood Center in the Richmond district in San Francisco. I can't say that enough, so because it oftentimes does get confusing for people. So we are very hyper local because we are focused on the west side of the city, specifically the northern west side of the city. We run after school programs at 9 public schools in the Richmond district. And so that's, even though we're so hyper local, we serve a lot of families. We also run 3 food pantries that serve mostly seniors who, many of whom are monolingual Chinese speakers. And so that's 1,000 people that we serve of that population as well. So we have a large reach despite our very hyper local focus. And then we have this community arm, which, to be honest, it kind of started to grow out of kind of some political work that was needed to be done around education in the Richmond district to inform people and keep people educated. So we created this kind of community arm that does work around, we put on festivals, we do forums, educational forums, and well, now Zoom webinars, and many times those things will evolve around a particular issue. And so we do that type of work. We have also put out information on ballot measures, and what we do is we pick ballot measures that specifically relate and affect the people that we serve. There's thousands of families that go to public schools of all different income needs, and so many of these decisions that our local decision makers are making and that come up on the ballot directly affect them in their everyday lives. And so that's the piece of the work that we want to make sure people understand, letting them know that this will affect you. Vote however you want. This is the information about it, and do that in a non-biased way. So that's the work that we do. We have voter registration at fairs, and we encourage our staff to vote. I think there's a lot more we could do around that, which I think we'll get to later. And then I'll say probably the heaviest lift are those candidate forums that were mentioned, that you mentioned later, and I can go into those more in depth later if that's important to anyone. So yeah, that's the work that we do.
Wonderful, thank you. I love all the points you're making, but in particular the point that you're making about voters understanding how elections affect their own lives and why it's important for them to participate. That's great. Cordelia.
Sure. Hey, everyone. So glad to be here. My name is Cordelia, and I'm Director of Organizing at Arts for LA. Arts for LA is a network of over 70,000 arts advocates from across the LA region. We really serve to be the voice for the arts, for arts and culture in, again, the LA County. We have a membership that is cross-sector, cross-discipline. So we are convening and fighting for the individual arts and culture practitioner, the small, the mid-size, collective, nonprofit, as well as the large cultural institutions in the sector. So again, that sort of large network of folks. And we do this through a number of ways. We really make sure, a big part of our work is making sure arts and culture is represented in cross-sector policy spaces. We have a strong sort of policy and advocacy program, all based in community listening. So we hold community listening sessions throughout the year to really make sure our policy and advocacy agenda is grounded in grassroots community needs. We also do policy advocacy sort of paradigm and system shifting work in partnership with all of our incredible members and fellow arts advocates. We're a convener in the region, sort of pulling folks together to talk about these issues. Leadership development is the last sort of key pillar of what we do through our Activate leadership development programs. So if you are interested in arts advocacy or know an arts leader in LA County, please encourage them to check out our Activate leadership development programs. And in terms of our work or in and around elections, we definitely, and again, I'll sort of give an overview and then we'll be more than happy to dive into specifics as we continue the conversation. We definitely look at, taking positions on ballot measures that have the potential to impact arts and culture. Often it's drawing attention to things that folks might not think of as arts issues. I think one thing I can sort of bring to this space is arts and culture often isn't thought of as an election season issue, right? So part of the project and part of what we do is making sure folks are bringing that identity as an artist, as an arts and culture advocate to how they approach electoral season, right? And so we do work at the ballot initiative sort of level, and then we think about how can folks engage the hyperlocal electoral races, again, just thinking about themselves as an arts voter. So I really think about our work in this sort of, as I call it, election season, as defining, creating, and making more visible a constituency that typically isn't thought about as an election season constituency, which is the arts voter and the arts advocate. So we do that in a number of different and specific ways that, again, I'm sure we'll sort of dig into as we move forward. But again, I think for me, it's really always my North Star is thinking about that project of how do we articulate and make visible a constituency and thus build power for it. And that constituency is the arts voter. So it's a little bit about our work and how we approach the topic at hand.
Great, thank you. I'm struck by what you're saying about defining and really making more visible a constituency, because I think even though you're talking about the arts, that's definitely applicable to other communities that we as nonprofits serve. So really great point. Okay, so let's start with why. I mean, I said a little bit about why nonprofits should engage in this work, and you've touched on it already in your opening comments, but is there anything else you'd like to say about why your organization, or just why you think nonprofits should be engaged in voter education work? And anybody who wants to jump in can jump in.
Maybe start. I think that the communities that are most impacted by issues from homelessness to immigration to criminal justice are not always reflected in our electorate or in our election process. And it isn't because people are apathetic or don't want to be involved. It isn't because folks don't care about political processes, but there are many tangible barriers and obstacles to voting for communities. People who are focused on survival have a lot less ability to focus on how to navigate our election process. So it's important that community groups like ours, like yours, are connecting folks to resources that can help them understand this process, their rights, and how to engage. For example, all of us on Zoom have internet access. If we wanted to figure out the day of the election or where to go to our polling places, we could Google it, but we've seen, for example, during this pandemic, how there are disparities in internet access. So for folks who don't have internet access, how are they finding that information? If you're a person who needs language translation, how do you know how to get translated ballots? If you have a disability, what accessible technology is available to you and how do you find that information out? A lot of our work is really connecting folks to resources and helping folks understand, how you can engage in this election process if you don't already have that information easily available to you.
Kristen, before Michelle and Cordelia jump in, can you say a little bit about what some of the organizations that are part of your network are doing too? I know it's a little sidestep from the why, but I think it's
yeah, absolutely. So we have organizations in our coalition that range in the topics that they focus on, from health to education to criminal justice. And so our folks really try to integrate voter engagement into the work and the services that they're already providing. So for example, if you are working with folks who are in reentry programs, who are just coming out of being incarcerated, informing them that now their right to vote has been restored since 2020 and Prop 17 is passing, informing them about how they can register to vote. We also have organizations that work with the houseless community. And so, for example, during the census, when people were providing like care packages to houseless folks, with food and whatnot, in those, you can also include flyers and inserts around, this is why the census is important. This is why you should be voting. This is how, the issues that you care about as far as homelessness and resources for homeless programs can be impacted during this election. So integrating that into the work they already do.
That's great. Thank you. I love what you were saying about connecting folks to information. That seems really fundamental to the work. Other comments about why do this? Cordelia or Michelle, did you want to jump in? Michelle.
I might jump in here. I think that if you think about what is happening in San Francisco, well, let me just say, I've worked for the Neighborhood Center for 20 years, and the people we served and the funding that we got was very different back then from what it is now. And I think a lot of that has to do with some decisions that were made at the polls by people who live here. And so the high cost of living, the lack of housing for low-income folks, for families who need public schools, that has to do with education. So in my opinion, it's our responsibility to step up and educate so that we can keep San Francisco, or maybe bring back San Francisco to the place that what we want the values to reflect. So if we want our city to reflect the values of supporting the most vulnerable people in our community, we need to educate people on the policies and the decisions that they can make at the polls to ensure that that happens. So when I think of topics like funding for children's programs and to housing, those are things that the funding to children's programs directly affects us. Housing is an indirect effect, but it does affect the people that we serve, and will in the long run, as an organization that plans to be here in the community for hundreds of years. So we've got 40 down. We want to be able to continue to do this work. So that's a little bit more about why I believe it's important. And
Great, thank you. Cordelia, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, I really want to echo and uplift what Kristen and Michelle both shared. I think really recognizing barriers to getting to the polls is so key. So I really want to uplift that, Kristen, and then to sort of pick up and just make explicit a piece Michelle was raising. I think nonprofits and community-based organizations are particularly positioned to really make clear the importance of hyperlocal elections, right, and hyperlocal ballot issues. The federal, the national, sometimes the state level, particularly executive state level sort of races suck up so much oxygen in the room, yet such crucial decisions and funding decisions, policy decisions are being made at the local level, and they're often overlooked. And I think the folks who are often best positioned to sort of point voters, potential voters, to the real impact these hyperlocal issues and elections will have are community-based organizations. So that's just another, I think, really critical piece is making sure we don't overlook the importance of school board elections, local municipal elections, et cetera, and all the down ballot races, right? Yeah.
Great point. Okay, those local elections have a big effect on us and our communities. And I like the point, Michelle, that you made about we want our communities to reflect our values, and being involved in this work is a way to make sure that happens. Okay, let's dig in a little deeper on the what. We've talked about candidate forums. Love to hear more about engagement in those, and kind of how do you get started if you've never done one before? Michelle, it sounds like you've been involved in those. Do you partner with other people? What do you do? What's the way to get started on something like that?
exactly, it's the key. The key is partnership and reflecting different. What we've done is we find other people to partner with who are covering different topics. So a nonprofit that might work specifically more closely with seniors. Ours is very focused on youth and families. And then we might partner with someone who works with mental health. So, I forget if I mentioned housing there too. So we work collaboratively on that. And so it's like I mentioned previously, it is a heavy lift. It's a lot of work to make it happen. One year we had 11 candidates. So it was quite, we were like, this can't happen as a panel. This has to happen yet we wanted to make sure there was an opportunity for the public to have an intimate, experience to get to really truly know the candidates. The panel asking 11 people a series of questions is just not going to get to that. So what we did was we had actually the candidates we had everyone break out into small random groups, and so a public of maybe, I think 50 people showed up. So they all got in small groups of like, let's see, I think we did 11, it was more than 50 people. And so each candidate had to go around to each group and ask questions and answer questions that the public had there. So it was a different way of handling something like that, right? Which was a very heavy lift. But in a webinar, it can be a little easier. So we've done Zoom during the pandemic. We did some Zoom forums. Yeah, that's a little bit more how we do it. It's definitely collaborate and think about the process and what's going to give the public who attends the best experience that they can get and the most information.
That's great. And given that it is a heavy lift, wonderful to have partners who can take some of that load off. And I love the way you made it clear that it was a nonpartisan event, that, there were a lot of candidates, all were invited, and then you set up a way for it to be nonpartisan and how the public accessed information. That's great. Anything else that you all want to say about candidate forums?
Be sure you know what your desired outcomes are. I think to Michelle's point, exactly, that's the biggest piece of advice I can have. It's really easy to get into full event planning mode, and they are heavy lifts. And there's a lot of checking and double checking to make sure you're going about outreach the right way. And I think it's just really crucial to know ahead of time, what you want the audience to get out of it, what your organizational outcomes are going to be, right? In terms of how is it aligning with the mission. So those are, I think that is the biggest piece of advice that I have, just to add on to Michelle's. Comment.
Thank you. Okay. Let's talk about some things that aren't as big of a lift as a candidate forums. What are some other things that you all engage in that you would recommend to participants in this webinar that they could try if they haven't done this work before? I think there was mention of engaging staff in making sure they're voting, things like that don't take as much of a lift to do. Love to hear those thoughts. And anybody jump in.
I think, go ahead. I think another potential opportunity is just social media and digital campaigning is really big and really helpful. Like, social media is free. It's free to have an Instagram and a Twitter. You can post things on your website. Like, voter guides are really important. Like, connecting it to the work you do and the needs of the community you serve. So, if you're focused on education, what positions are on the ballot that are going to impact education? And how can you let folks know about what those positions are, how they serve the community, and why it's important to vote for those positions? So voter guides and engagement also through digital and social media.
Can you just dig in a little deeper on the social media? That was actually one of the advanced questions that we got. So what do you do? Do you post on Twitter? How do you make sure that things are nonpartisan? And say a little bit, if you wouldn't mind, saying a little bit more about what you all do in the community, the organizations in your network.
Yeah, I think like some of the nonpartisan things that are important to raise for folks are like deadlines. This is the last day to register. This is how many days you have to vote. If you're focused on like local elections, then you also might be able to also list, these are the drop box locations. These are the polling center locations. I think folks are still learning how to navigate elections because a lot of counties have recently become voters' choice act counties. And so there's confusion with folks who have traditionally gone to different polling places that have changed, and everybody's getting mail-in ballots. And so like just general information around how to vote, how to register is also really important, beyond some of the deeper like candidate forum stuff.
That's really great. And that gets to Cordelia's point about the barriers to people actually getting to the polls. If you make it really, really easy, I've heard of nonprofits even driving people to polling locations and stuff, but having that information about what you need to do this, you need to do that, being really clear. That's great. Other ideas of kind of less heavy lifts, activities that nonprofits can engage in this work?
Yeah. So we, again, I think part of this this sort of project, as I like to refer to it, of like articulating the constituency of the arts voter, right? Something we've started doing is we come up with a list of questions we want every arts voter to be asking themselves in the lead up to the election, right? So sort of like, what do we wish folks were sort of thinking about as they went into the polls? And it's certainly not taking a position on any specific election or even necessarily an issue. And I can drop the link in a second, to a toolkit that Arts for LA develops and distributes. It's called our Arts Vote Toolkit. And it's 5 ready-made, very simple sort of Instagram ready tiles that just say 4 questions every arts voter should be asking themselves, right? Do I know where my candidates stand on XYZ? Do I know where my school board candidates stand on arts education? Have I thought about where my mayor is planning on funding arts and culture in an equitable way in the future, right? So again, just sort of getting our arts advocates and constituents to be thinking in this way in the lead up to the election, not necessarily even trying to engage directly with the hyperlocal races themselves. So, and then we also put out calls to actions around mobilizing community, right? Study after study after study shows that folks with a plan to vote are far, far, far likelier to vote. So encouraging our leaders to do that, play that role in their communities as well. 2 simple things that folks can do. And again, yeah, to Kristen's excellent points about the sort of flexibility and utility and cost effectiveness of social media assets, as well as her earlier point about removing those barriers for folks in the community to get to the polls.
Great, thank you, Michelle. Oh, and Cordelia, please do put that link to the toolkit in the chat. That would be wonderful. And again, we can adapt these strategies, even if we're not an arts organization, we can adapt these strategies to the work that we do. So, Michelle, yeah, did you want to add?
Sure. I think an easy thing is when you do festivals or events to have voter registration there, which was mentioned, and then encouraging our staff to vote. I think there's more we can do with that. And at meetings, having people from both sides, like at community meetings, we've had people from both sides or all sides of that, like, for example, for ballot measures or looking at a ballot, kind of goes through each ballot and lets people know. So you just invite someone, a local organization that you trust and that and can give both sides very through non-biased, but at least you're giving that information to folks to make their own decisions. And that's something that you just invite them into whatever already standing meetings you have or events and activities that you have, and you just make that time on an agenda. So that's something. We've also, because we are located in a pretty central location in the Richmond district, we have been a place for people to, when there's a ballot measure that is a very relevant and obvious ballot measure that, for example, a children's fund ballot, that's something that we might be a place where they can drop off ballots and we can disseminate to the community there, where neighbors can come pick up a sign if they want. And so that might be something else that we do.
Yeah, that's really great. I'm thinking about the fact that you have a lot of constituents come to you to a physical space, and it sounds like you also provide information when you go to events, festivals, and when you're tabling. Are there any other things that have to do with having a physical space where people are coming to you that you think nonprofits can try? I mean, do you put out materials around election times for like voter registration materials, or are there other things like that that you all do, or that you think organizations that have people coming to them can do? And I know that's been a bit odd during the pandemic, but it is still for direct services and essential services happening. Any thoughts along those lines?
I do want to just uplift. There was a big effort. Arts for LA helped support this effort, but it was an incredible sort of community effort amidst the arts and culture community in Los Angeles to get arts and culture institutions designated and opened as voting centers. So that was a really exciting way to sort of sort of shift thinking about the role of the arts and culture institution and create sort of new ways and increase access to that space. So just wanted to float that really quickly as an exciting, and that's an effort. That's not low hanging fruit by any stretch of the imagination. But I think it's also helpful just to throw out there models that are might take multiple years to build towards, but are just like really exciting potential options for folks with that physical space.
That's great. And having a Dropbox at your nonprofit is another one. I live in a small community, and there's now a Dropbox right outside our library, our public library, and that's not a nonprofit, but I'm reminded every time I go past that Dropbox of voting and elections. So I think even just little things like that engage people in elections in ways they might not be otherwise. Anything else about the physical space? Michelle, is there anything else you wanted to add about that before we move on?
Yeah, I think it was just using your physical space for voter registration, and also we've been a voting site as well. So that's we have to remove everything that we've had, that if there was something that a ballot measure that we may have been promoting, that we make sure that's not there, and we have to be very careful about that. But we have been a space because we're in a very key location, easy to get to place. So that has been something we've been before.
Great. So in addition to providing information and actually being a voter, a polling location, being a Dropbox location, helping people register. I know I've heard of nonprofits providing laptops for their constituents to be able to register to vote because they didn't have access to the internet, to your earlier point, Kristen, about barriers to accessing the internet. So great. Those are all wonderful ideas. Anything else anybody wants to add at this point about tips that you'd recommend to nonprofits? What about new nonprofits? Are there particular things they can try, given that they're new as organizations?
One thing I was going to add, kind of related to the last question as well, is just like to not think of voter engagement as like this big, like lofty thing, but like it's really just talking to voters and engaging voters. And you can do that in like a bunch of different ways. So if you're sending out newsletters, if you have a space and it's just flyers and having information available, if you're doing any webinars or other programs, like how can you also integrate into there? Hey, also a reminder about this. If you're having community meetings, things like that, like it really is just talking to voters, and it doesn't have to be some super extensive like program or anything like that.
Really great points. And I've heard of people talking about it in staff meetings, even just mentioning that there's an election coming up. Okay, great. And thank you for the questions, participants. And please, if you can, put them in the Q&A box, and we will get to them soon. I'm going to ask the panelists maybe one or two more questions, and then we'll get to your questions. So really appreciate it. What are some activities that you hope to do as an organization or network going forward that you haven't taken on but you'd like to? And why, I think would be helpful. Anybody can jump in. Michelle, I know there's some things you all have in mind that you would like to take on.
I know that we have, so I always focus on my staff members. We have 150 staff members, well, on a good year of hiring. And they're mostly based in, many of them based in San Francisco. So it's important to educate them on voting and making sure that actually, even whether or not you live in San Francisco or not, definitely vote, right? So that's obvious. But what I realized too, and just being part of this webinar, is that we have a lot of volunteers as well. And we have over 100 volunteers. And they obviously very much care about the work enough that they're coming to our neighborhood center and giving their time. I wonder how much of the connection they're making between the work that they're doing and the choices they're making at the ballot. So I would love to create opportunities when we do volunteer appreciations or volunteer events, that we could let them know a little bit more about what our values are and how those are reflected in, those can be reflected in the way that you cast your vote at the ballot. So
That's great. That's another group of people that you interact with that you can
Mhm.
provide information to. Wonderful. Others, Kristen or Cordelia? What do you hope to do going forward?
So right now we are doing Get Out the Vote outreach for the June primary. We'll also be doing Get Out the Vote outreach for the fall for the general election. But I think another part of our work is like building the capacity of our coalition members to also do this work and to do this outreach and to understand how to engage with voters. And like a really big important part of that is like integrated voter engagement, which is not just engaging voters in like these few weeks around election time, but continuing to engage them throughout the year. Like I think what really makes folks civically engaged in the long term is that they're engaged in this process throughout, not just in the few weeks for the election, but also in the implementation process and holding their election officials accountable, like continuing to talk to voters to say, you know, you voted and now this. There's also a next step after that to continue this process, to continue to be engaged and paying attention. So.
Great points. Yeah, the work isn't just during election season. Great. Cordelia, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I know. I'm so grateful you raised that, Kristen, because I think, I was going to say something very similar, which is implementation of anything that passes is 9/10 of the law. So we really, look at the work of sort of being an arts voter as year round and full time, right? So once something passes, I think part of the project of mobilizing and getting folks really excited about this, let's say in this case, we're talking about a ballot measure, is getting also those organizers and leaders savvy and in place to ensure that the implementation of it, when it passes, right, is aligned with values, is equitable, right, is serving mission, et cetera. So that's a huge piece. I think Arts for LA is really focused on building out that capacity of following, and it's a big part of our work and has been historically, but ensuring implementation goes the way we want it to when folks have worked so hard to get something passed. And I think the other piece too is we're really looking at a distributed model of this work too, right? Understanding, again, I think our focus is on these hyper local elections. How can we create and empower community leaders to do this mobilization in their community? So, we've in the past run trainings where we have folks come in and sort of give them the tools that might help support their leadership, but really beginning to think about that turnkey model in an even more intentional way of how can we empower leaders to do this work on their own in communities across the region. And I think that ties into my last thing really quickly, which is, again, an echo, incredible panelists. It's really been great to learn from you. But if you are a nonprofit that is either part of a coalition, potentially the organizer of a coalition, I think it is so crucial to do that education as CalNonprofits is currently doing, but I think all of us as well in our sort of subcommittees or subcommunities is making sure nonprofits understand that they can and should be engaging around elections and around ballot initiatives, right? I think there understandably is a lot of fear and a lot of anxiety around this work. And I get it, it's complicated, but being in community, working through some of those questions one has, being able to sort of bounce a promising practice off of a coworker or an aligned organization, that's what will really sort of, I think, move the needle on nonprofits really stepping into this space and doing this work when I think it's really urgent in this moment that we do. So just want to applaud sort of like this effort, but also empower everyone on this call, even if you're don't necessarily think of your organization as a coalition leader. Boom, ta-da, now you are. Like, what are the aligned nonprofits working in and around your community, and how can you come together to sort of think through strategies communally so that we can really encourage nonprofit leaders? And then that looks like encouraging staff and nonprofit leadership, but boards as well, making sure boards understand what is allowable, making sure thinking through in community with each other, what are the processes that are going to make the board feel comfortable moving in a timely fashion, but a thoughtful and intentional fashion. And what are the processes we can point to as well when maybe a program participant, a community member say, hey, how did you get at the decision to endorse this ballot measure? Or why are you doing this? We can say, okay, well, here's sort of the procedure we've established and the protocol. And there's no one size fits all. There's no one way to do it, which again is why I'm saying I think it's really important to sort of come together and work in partnership with your aligned organizations, with your sort of cohort of nonprofits to think through some of these questions and align impact. So.
Okay, great. Well, if you've got questions, if you're a participant and you've got questions, please put them in the Q&A if you can. I think we've responded to all the questions that I've seen in the chat so far, but if you've got any additionals, and we had some advanced questions that I'm going to turn to in a minute, but can we stay on the board issue for just a minute? If you're a nonprofit who hasn't engaged in this work, and you want to talk to your board about it so that you can engage, you know, you're a staff person and you really think that this is important work to do, what are some tips for engaging the board in supporting this work? Anybody jump in?
Find the board member who I think is inclined towards this, right? I think having, as always, I think having board member or board members plural who really understand the vision and importance to help you lead this effort and this conversation, because it's going to be a conversation with a board, right? If this is not sort of traditionally been part of your work, right? It's going to be a process. And I think understanding that it might have to move a little slower in order to move far and be sustainable. But that would be my first tip is who on the board do you think will align with and opening up that conversation with those members that sort of are with you on the starting line of this conversation already, right? Yeah.
Great, thanks. Michelle or Kristen, anything you want to add to that one?
You know, I think just impressing upon folks, like, how are you building power to make the changes that you want to see and that you need for whatever the topic is of your organization? Like, if you think that we don't have enough educational resources and you're not involved in voting, how are we getting them? Like, asking these kind of critical questions around, like, how are we building power to make the changes that we need?
I agree with all of that. I have a board member that I go to whenever a topic comes up and I'm like, here's how I feel about this. This is where I think our organization should stand on it. And we talk it through, we let the rest of the board know, this is what we're gonna do about this particular issue. Definitely open communication, but there are particularly policy folks that are really good to have on your board that you can talk those things out with.
Wonderful, thank you. Okay, we've got a question about, do nonprofits have to register anywhere if they're going to help with voter registration? Anybody want to jump in on that? Is there any official place they have to register to help their community register to vote?
We usually just find an organization will come to us and say, hey, I heard you're doing this festival. Can we table at it? And it's usually, I think, a city based out of the city to encourage people to vote. So it's non-biased and we make sure that that's what we do. So I don't know the answer to that question. So. Okay.
Anybody else?
I also don't know the answer specifically, but I do know that if you connect with the Secretary of State office, like sometimes that's where you can get registration forms, or your like county registrar office. That's also how you can get registration forms as well.
Great. Yeah, my understanding is you don't have to register in any official way, but those places are great places to go to get voter registration forms and voter registration information, both at the county and state level. So Cordelia, anything else you want to add on that one?
I don't believe so. I think I would just echo, yeah, I think this is the place where, you know, partnership is key. And I think I always think about, okay, what's the value you bring as the organization is the one-on-one relational organizing, right? Like the relationships in the community and sort of bringing folks into the conversation about registration through your event, through when they pick their kid up from your program, right? From you're at the end of your training, right? And so, and then passing them off into the hands of the trusted, you know, the neutral, nonpartisan folks who have the registration process down is typically how I've done it in past. Yeah.
Okay, great. So we've got just a couple more minutes and we've got a few more questions that came in the advanced questions. How do I get started creating a get out the vote plan? if I want to have a plan? I mean, do I start with outreach, figuring out how I can reach my community? What information would they want? I mean, what are some of the first steps I would take in developing a GOTV plan?
Maybe you could start with assessing like what are the specific needs of your community. For example, LA has like one of the largest Black immigrant populations. So if we're talking to Black immigrants, what do they need? Maybe they need language translation. And so part of my voter guide is how to get them ballots translated in the languages that they need. But like really paying attention to who is your base and what information do they specifically need, because all of the information may not be necessary or relevant to them, but focusing on that and then filling your voter guide with that.
Wonderful, thanks. Cordelia, Michelle, anything you want to add?
That makes total sense. I love that, going with that. And then also maybe looking at partners and collaborators that can go in on this with you.
And I think the last thing is you don't have to, start at 90 miles an hour, starting small with a particular program or sort of segment of your community, really starting there and using the strategies that were just voiced by my two excellent co-panelists of really needs assessment. And I think that's just start small is also the piece of advice I would give. Yeah.
Okay, well, we are just about at time. Any other final comments that you want to make sure that participants hear? Just in the remaining, I'm going to assume if I don't hear from you that the answer is no, but please jump in.
I think the thing that I heard mentioned when we were starting this, organizing this webinar was, if more people who worked for nonprofits voted, we'd have better policies for housing, youth, seniors, like the whole, the thing that maybe mentioning about the values of where we would truly reflect the values that we hold. So I like that.
Wonderful closing comment. Thank you, Michelle. And thank you to our fantastic panelists, Kristen, Cordelia, and Michelle. Each of you bring such great perspectives and experience. So thank you so much. Let's go to our closing slides. We're going to close down. So again, I want to thank our panelists for their incredible comments and information. I also want to thank our tech staff, Vanessa and Lynn, and our closed captioner, Joe. I want to remind everybody the webinar has been recorded, and resources and the recording will come to everybody who registered for the webinar in the next few days. So stay tuned for that email coming to you. Next slide. And I just want to remind you that CalNonprofits is a membership organization. And if you are not yet a member, we would love to have you join. There are a lot of great reasons why you should become a member of CalNonprofits. Here are some of the reasons on this slide. If you would like to join, which we hope you will, you can get a 20% discount if you are a new member. Just put in webinar 22. And you can also reach out. Oh, there's some information in the chat that you can also access. So with that, again, I want to thank our panelists, tech team, and closed captioner, and wish everybody a great day.